some introductory remarks. Rabbi?
That's fine. Connecting the dots with Dayton, Ohio.
Yes.
And so there was a time before we had the internet and these kinds of things when, you had to rely on the written word. And so Abe, I think Arthur also were beneficiaries of Rabbi Riemer's sermons. And Abe had this binder, big, 3-ring binder with all these sermons in them. And then at some point in his life, he shared them with me. And I'm coming forward now because I know that you had to be on the secret list, the secret transcript list. And he was he was trying to stay true, but finally, he gave in and showed me the sermon. So anyway, we know about Rabbi Riemer, and we've heard of him, and we're very excited to have you finally in person with us, and to give us a little of your Tom and your Torah.
Thank you. So I'm just going to say a couple of words and then hand it over to Johanna, who has a couple of things to say, and then we will begin our formal program for the night. I just wanted to add that I was gifted the subscription of Rabbi Riemer's Torah because he gave it to me himself when I was working with the esteemed with the esteemed development director of JTS in Florida, Carolyn Cantor. So she and I would go around and meet all of the what would you say, the celebrities of the JTS world. And Rabbi Riemer, of course, was on that list, and so we would have lunch and we would talk, and it was really quite a pleasure and a blessing to get to know him a little bit at that time. But I think my favorite experience of learning with Rabbi Riemer was in this small group study for donors. And he gave the history of Kaplan and Heschel and those years. And that lecture just brought me into the halls of JTS. Rabbi Riemer has a way of telling stories like no other rabbi I've ever met. And it's really a blessing, and we're quite proud that we can bring you to our congregation for the Rabbi Kenneth Bromberg and Johanna Bromberg lecture series. Johanna?
All right. First of all, Baruchim Habayim. Welcome, Rabbi Riemer, and welcome all of our friends who are here with us tonight. I was invited to say a few sentences about the sponsor of the Congregation Beth Shalom Scholar in Residence program. Since the 1980s, it's been a tradition to invite scholars to CBS for a weekend to teach us from our sources. At the time of Rabbi Ken's death, many contributions were made to CBS, and many continue their tradition of contributions to this fund.
Okay, I don't know.
As adult education had been an abiding love of Rabbi Ken, it was agreed that it would be most appropriate to establish the Rabbi Ken Bromberg Adult Education Fund to enable a scholar annually to come to the congregation and the wider community for a weekend of teaching and learning.
Don't wait till I'm on. I'm not on.
I know. No, you're here.
Am I on?
Okay.
I think that's the easiest, because housekeeping will be housekeeping, maintenance will be doing maintenance, presentation.
Right.
Are we back on?
You're good,
You
Johanna. Good, Johanna.
the original plan was to have an annual scholar in residence around the time of Rabbi Ken's yahrzeit, which is in late October. But this year has been different. Many of us have enhanced our learning in all areas through Zoom. And rather than a weekend of having a scholar in residence with us, we shall learn this evening and on Thursday evening from Rabbi Riemer. It's appropriate to enhance our learning in anticipation of Shavuot and to learn on this most recent of days of observance in our Jewish calendar, Yom Yerushalayim. Some of you have already made contributions to the Rabbi Ken Bromberg Adult Education Fund. Toda Rabbah, many thanks. May I invite all of us in honor of, in memory of, in appreciation of, and in anticipation of future learning during weekends from scholars at CBS to make your contributions to the Rabbi Kenneth Bromberg Adult Education Fund at Congregation Beth Shalom. In this way, we can each and all participate in our tradition of Say Ulmad, go and learn. And now, let's prepare to be challenged by Rabbi Riemer.
Hello,
You're on.
You're on. Fuck.
am I on? Okay, thank you very much for those generous introductions. And thank you for inviting me to Zoom across the state and study Torah with you tonight. And thank you for having this program in honor of Rabbi Kenneth Bromberg, for there's no greater honor that you can give to any rabbi than to study Torah in his memory. I knew Kenny Bromberg at the seminary, and I knew him when he was in Kansas City. So I know how much Jewish education meant to him. And I pray that my words tonight will be worthy of his memory. I have never been to Clearwater, and there are possibly some people here who have never been to Boca, but there are several things that unite us. One is we're united by this new technology that enables you to live on one side of the state and me to live on the other side of the state, and we can study together. When I was growing up, I had no idea, I never heard of a Zoom. The only Zoom I knew was Zoom Gully Gully that we sang in Hebrew school. But now we've got this new gadget that enables us to see each other and hear each other and learn from each other from one end of the world to the other. And we should be very grateful that we have it and know that it has come along just in time. Can you imagine how bored our lives would be if we were quarantined, stuck in our homes for over a year and we didn't have this device? And more than that, you could be living in the 4th century. I could be living in the 14th century. Your native language could be Arabic or Ladino or Spanish. My native language could be French or German or Yiddish, but a shared attachment to the Torah is what would connect us to each other. And so I want to tell you a story tonight. I love stories, and I especially love love stories. I think that God probably loves stories too. Otherwise, why would God have created the world? Was he short of aggravation? But if he had not created the world, how dull and boring God's life would be, because there would be no stories. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is the story of David and Bathsheba. The story that has only 4 characters, maybe 5 if you count God. I'm going to tell it to you a number of times. First, as it's found in the Bible. Then, as it's told in the Talmud. Then, as it appears in modern Hebrew literature. Then, as it plays itself out in Washington. And then, as it appears in a certain Hollywood movie. And each time I'm going to ask you the same question. According to this version, who's the hero and who's the villain? I think the answer changes every time. Let's begin with the biblical story. David is one of the central figures in the Bible. Nobody, with the exception of Moses, gets as many pages in the Bible as he does. David is a great shepherd, a great poet, a great fighter, a great lover, a great musician, a great healer, a great leader, a great sinner, and a great repenter. And it's probably appropriate to study David on today because David, more than anybody else, created Jerusalem as the center of the Jewish country. And David conquered more of the land of Israel than anybody up until the 6-Day War. Everyone loved David. God loved David. Therefore, even though he was the youngest in his family, God sends the prophet Samuel to tell him he's going to be the king of Israel. Saul loves David. When Saul was having a breakdown, David would play the harp for him, and David's music soothed Saul and enabled him to rest. When David went out to fight Goliath, Saul tried to give him his own shield and his own sword. He thought these things would help him. But David was a very, very tall man. Saul was a very tall man, and David was a very short man. He couldn't walk in Saul's boots. They were too big for him. And he couldn't even lift Saul's sword. And he couldn't walk with his shield. They were too heavy for him. And so he says to the king, "Thank you, but no thank you. I would rather go out against Goliath with just my slingshot and a few stones." And sure enough, David kills Goliath with one shot from that slingshot. By the way, that's not a naive strategy. If you fight somebody with a sword, you got to get up close to him, within sword's reach. And if David had gotten close to Goliath, the giant would have killed them, swatted them the way you kill a bed bug. But with a bow and arrow, you can dance around the giant all day, and he won't be able to reach you. And so David knew what he was doing when he chose to fight with a bow and arrow and not with a sword. The people loved David. They loved David more than they loved Saul. Whenever they came back from a victory, the people would call out, "Hooray for Saul, who has killed hundreds," and double hooray for David, who has killed Solomon, thousands. If you were Saul, how would you feel when you heard those words? The people loved David more than they loved Saul. And Jonathan, the son of David, the son of Saul, loved David more than he loved his father. When he found out that his father was going to kill David at the Rosh Chodesh meal, Jonathan warned David to stay away and saved his life. Did David love Jonathan? Maybe. When Saul and Jonathan were involved in a battle against the Philistines, David arrived too late to save them. He wrote a wonderful eulogy on the death of Jonathan, in which he says, "Jonathan, Jonathan, I love you. My soul is bound up with yours." But he arrived too late to save them. Michal, the daughter of Saul, loved David more than she loved her father. When his father sent police to arrest David, she tied a rope and lowered him down from the window so they could get away. And then she stalled the soldiers and kept them waiting outside the door so that David would have time to run away. And she was left to face the anger of her father. Michal saved the life of David. So it's clear that she loved him. Does David love Michal? I don't know. He ran into the wilderness in order to get away from Saul, and he's lonely there, so he marries. And he's still lonely, so he marries again. And he's still lonely, so he marries again. He ends up marrying 6 women in order to overcome his loneliness. And in all that time, he never sends even a single postcard to Michal. It's only years later, when it's politically advantageous for him to do so in order to unite the country, that he takes her back. And you know what it's like when they meet after so many years of separation? Have you ever had the experience, somebody mentioned it a minute ago, of going to your high school reunion and you meet the guy or the girl that you were once in love with, and now he's fat, and now she looks very different, and you wonder, what did I ever see in him? That's the way it was with David and Michal. When they finally met, after years of separation, they had nothing in common. There's one scene that demonstrates the chasm between them. They bring the ark back from the Philistines, and David goes out and dances before the ark. He dances with all his heart and all his soul. And Michal looks down from the balcony and she says sarcastically, "Look how the king of Judah has cheapened himself today. Look, by dancing with the slave girls, by dancing in public, my father would never have done that." And David looks up at her and he says, "I wasn't dancing with the slave girls. I was dancing before the Lord. I was dancing before the Lord who took the throne away from your father and gave it to me." And then the Bible says, and Michal had no children for the rest of her life. She remained a bitter woman who lived in the harem while the king ignored her and made love to other women. That's the end of the love story of David and Michal. But until this chapter, everybody loves David. God loves David. Saul loves David. Jonathan loves David. Michal loves David. The people love David up until this chapter. And then, up until this chapter, David lives a charmed life. From this chapter on, David's life goes straight down. From this chapter on, his life is one tragedy after another. One of his children dies in birth. Another one dies in a revolt against him. One of his children rapes his half-sister. From this chapter on, everything in the life of David goes straight down. So let's look at this chapter and see what happens. It's chapter 11 of 2 Samuel. You know what 2 Samuel is? It's the second half of the book of Samuel. The book was too heavy and too long to fit onto one scroll, and so they wrote it on 2 volumes. That's why we've got 2 books of Samuel. By the way, do you know the dumb joke about the tourist who goes on a trip to Israel? And they come to one place, and the guide says, "This is where the prophet Samuel is buried." And the tourist says, "Yesterday we were with a different guide, and he showed us another place. And he said, that's where the prophet Samuel is buried." And the guide says, "That's 1 Samuel, and this is 2 Samuel." Okay, the chapter begins, "It came to pass in the springtime, at the season when kings go out to war." There's a hunting season, there's a football season, there's a season when kings go out to war. They usually go out to war in the springtime because the weather's good and the roads are clear. But this time it is different. This time David doesn't go to war. It says, Vayishlach. David sent. Instead of going to war himself, he sends the soldiers to war. Vahu Yoshev Yerushalayim. And he sits home in Jerusalem. Hold on to the word Vayishlach. It's going to be the key word of this chapter. It's going to appear in almost every sentence. But instead of going out to war himself, David sends his nephew Joab and the army to fight against Ammon, and they surround the city of Rabbah. Who knows where Amman is today? Anybody? Where's Amman today? That's not a hard question.
Jordan.
Jordan, it's the capital of Jordan. And listen to the next sentence. It came to pass around evening time that David got up from his afternoon nap. The soldiers are fighting out in the field, and David takes a siesta in the afternoon. There's an implied criticism in that story. And he goes up on the roof to take a walk. Houses in those days had flat roofs. And so David goes for a stroll on the roof of the palace. And from that roof, he happens to see a woman bathing. And this woman is very, very beautiful. I don't know, did she forget to pull down the shade? Did she do it on purpose in order to attract his attention? We don't know. All we know is that David went for a walk and he saw a woman bathing. And this woman was very, very beautiful. Vayishlach, and David sends to one of his staff and says, who is this woman? And the servant comes back with a strange answer. He says, Halozot, don't you know who she is? Don't you remember her? Which sounds like David knew her before. He says, she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She's married to one of the mercenaries in the army of David. Notice that last word, Uriah the Hittite, and ask yourself, would David have done what he did if she was married to an Israelite? Would David have committed adultery with this man's wife if he was a native? We don't know. The next verse says, Vayishlach, David sends again. He sends a messenger with an invitation. Dear Mrs. Uriah, you are hereby invited to have tea with His Majesty the King, 4 o'clock next Shabbos afternoon. If you got invitation to have tea with the Prime Minister of Canada, or with the Queen of England, or with the head of any important country, wouldn't you say yes? Wouldn't you send back an RSVP right away? You know what RSVP means. Remember, send wedding presents. Anyway, she goes to the palace at the invitation of the king. Va tishkavima. I don't know how to translate that phrase in mixed company. Va tishkavima. Let me translate it this way. The two of them had an intimate, private conversation. And as a result of that conversation, she became pregnant. And then the Bible adds one more minor detail. It says, V'hi mitkadesha mitumata, that she was over her menstrual period. Why on earth do we need to know that? Not because it means they violated the laws of Nida. If you violate the law of adultery, which is one of the big 10, which is one of the 10 commandments, does it really matter if you also violated the law about going to the mikveh? I don't think so. So why does the Torah add this minor detail? Anybody? I think it's important because it means that if her husband is away on the battlefield and if she is over her period since he went away and she becomes pregnant, she can't claim that he's the father. Isn't that clear? If she's had a finished her period since he left, he can't be the father. Anyway, David and Bathsheba have this intimate meeting in the palace, and then the lady goes home. And David probably figured if they're all finished. For him, it was probably just a casual encounter. or so we thought. But a few months later, Vatishlach, Bathsheba sends a message. Up to now, David has been sending in every sentence. Now Bathsheba sends a message. She sends a letter that consists of only 2 words. Or if there was more in the letter, the Torah doesn't bother to record it. She writes a letter that says, Hara Anochi, I'm pregnant. Did she say anything more? Did she say, what are we going to do now? Did she say, help? How are we going to avoid a scandal? Did she say regards from the rabbit? I don't know. The Torah only records 2 words. I'm pregnant. And now the question is, what will David do? In all the rest of the world, it would be no problem. In all the rest of the world, whoever and whatever the king wants, the king takes. But in Judea, and only in Judea, do they have these 10 commandments that we're going to celebrate on Shavuos. And one of them says, thou shalt not commit adultery. And in Judea, they have this weird idea, an idea that's absolutely not heard of in the rest of the ancient world. They have the idea that the king is not above the law. 10 commandments begin, I am the Lord your God. That means if nothing else, you're not God. And you're not able, you don't have the right to do what you want. So what does David do? Vayishlach. He sends a letter to his nephew Joab, who's the head of the army. And he says, do me a big favor. Send Uriah the Hittite back on furlough, so that supposedly he can give me a report on what's going on. And so Joab sends Uriah to David. Did anybody notice the difference between what David calls him and what Joab calls him? Anybody notice? David says, send me Uriah the Hittite, and Joab sends him Uriah. Did you see the one-word difference? Come on, that's not a hard question. Uriah leaves out the word the Hittite, because in the army military ethic, I don't care if you're a Hittite, I don't care if you're a Chinaman, I care, do you do your job? And if you do, I'm loyal to you, and I expect you to be loyal to me. And so in Joab's eyes, he's just Uriah. In David's eyes, he's Uriah the Hittite. And so Uriah comes home, and he reports to the king. And the king says, how you doing? And how is Yoav? How are the soldiers? How's the battle going? He pretends this is the reason why he called him home. And then after he gives his report, David says to him, you know, you came a long way. Why don't you go home and rest up and spend some time with your wife? David figures that Uriah will go home. He'll have a reunion with his wife. And then when the baby is born, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, who's counting? Either Uriah will believe that he's the father of the child, or else he's not going to be able to prove that he's not the father of the child. And either way, scandal will be averted. So David sends Uriah home. And then David calls the caterer. And he says, would you please send a fancy dinner to the house of Uriah? And write a note with it that says, to Bathsheba and Uriah, with best wishes for the king. And that's how Bathsheba finds out that her husband is in town. Because Uriah doesn't go home that night. Instead, he sleeps in the barracks together with all the other soldiers of the king. Now, let me just say this. I don't know about you. My experience has been when a couple commits adultery, the marriage was probably in not very good shape before it took place. There's usually a vacuum in the relationship, and the third party comes along and fills the vacuum. And that may have been the case here. We don't know. All we know is that Uriah did not go home that night, Instead, he went to sleep in the barracks together with all the other soldiers. Why is it important to know that he slept in the barracks with all the other soldiers? It means that we have witnesses that Uriah didn't go home that night. Nobody will ever be able to claim that he's the father of this child. He slept in the barracks, and there are witnesses. Vayagidu leDavid. David, like all kings and most presidents, has a secret service. And they follow Uriah. And they report to David that Uriah didn't go home that night, that he slept in the barracks together with all the other soldiers. So David calls Uriah back and he says to him, why didn't you go home last night? And listen to what Uriah says. How could I? My buddies are lying on the ground. My commander Yoav is on guard duty. I should go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? I swear by that which is holiest to me in the whole world, namely you. I swear by your life, how could I do such a thing? And David says, thanks. Now, did Uriah really mean, was he really so patriotic? Or was he, walls have ears, rumors travel, maybe he heard. Was he playing with David? I don't know. In the words of one of the great theologians of the 20th century, W.C. Fields, you can't cheat an honest man. And so Uriah's answer can be read in two ways. But David is now in big trouble. So he says to Uriah, why don't you stick around another day? What's your hurry to go back to the battlefield? So David stays another day, and Uriah stays another day. And David invites him to dinner at the palace, and he plies him with liquor in order to get him drunk. Figuring that he gives him enough to drink, his patriotism will dissolve, and he'll go home and he'll sleep with his wife. And at the end of the meal, Uriah staggers up from the table and he goes to sleep in the barracks together with the other soldiers. And now David is really desperate. And so he does something he would never have done if he were thinking clearly. He writes a letter to his nephew Yoav, and he gives it to Uriah to deliver. And in this letter, he says to Yoav, do me a big favor. Put Uriah in the front lines. Put him in the place where you know the enemy is the strongest. And then pull back and leave him out there by himself. He figures Uriah will die in battle, and he'll marry the widow. And when the baby is born, 6, 7 months, 8 months, who's counting? There'll be no scandal. David runs 2 big risks by writing this letter. The first is Job will have it, and he will be able to use it anytime he wants to for the rest of David's life to blackmail him. He'll have it in writing that David was willing to betray one of his own men and to lose a battle for his own selfish purposes. Yoav will keep that letter in his files he used against David whenever he wants to. And the other risk is that Uriah may open the letter on the way back to the army. And if he does, he'll know that David tried to have him killed so that he could marry his wife. Those are 2 big risks. But what can he do? David's desperate. So he writes the letter and he gives it to Uriah to deliver. Yoav reads the letter and he puts Uriah in the front line. And then the Bible says the enemy came out and struck at, whose name are you ready to hear? You're braced to hear the name of Uriah, right? But instead you find the name of Yoav. What's going on here? Yoav is a believer in military ethics. Soldiers obey their officers. Officers don't betray their soldiers. That's what the salute means. And so he can't do it. And at the last minute, he turns around, goes back to where the enemy's army is strongest, and he fought on the side of Uriah. But it was too late, because many soldiers died that day, and among those who died was Uriah. So it looks like scandal has been averted and everything is okay. But listen to what happens next. Up until now, David has been sending in almost every sentence. Now, Vayishlach Adonai, God sends. God sends the prophet Nathan to speak this to David. And Nathan tells this story. He says, Your Majesty, did you hear what happened? There were two people who lived in this town. One was rich and the other was poor. The rich man had a lot of sheep and a lot of cows. And the poor man had only one little lamb. And the poor man loved this lamb. He raised it together with his children. It ate at his table. It drank from his cup. It slept in his bed. It was like a favorite child to this poor man. And one day, a visitor came to the rich man's house for dinner. And the rich man was stingy with his own flock. He didn't want to take an animal from his own flock with which to make a meal for the guest. And so you know what he did? He went into the poor man's farm and he stole the little lamb from the poor man and he served it to his guest at dinner. When David heard that story, he went ballistic. He went into a rage. He said, by God, the man who did such a thing deserves to die. And Nathan says to him, Ata, you're the man. You're the man. You're the one who did it. You're the one who killed Uriah. Makes no difference if you did it by the hands of the Ammonites. Indirect murder is the same as direct murder. And you are a murderer. Look how much God did for you. And yet you killed Uriah. How dare you? You are a murderer in the eyes of God. You are a traitor. You are a blasphemer. Let me ask you, is that if that's the climax of the story, then Nathan is the hero, right? And David's the villain, right? But if you go on two more lines, David says, you're right. I have sinned, and I admit it, and I'm sorry, and I want to repent. I have sinned. Let me ask you, can you picture Mr. Putin or Mr. Trump or head of North Korea or the head of almost any other country in the world saying I was wrong? I don't think so. And so maybe David is the hero, maybe Nathan is the hero. I'll leave it to you to decide. But I can tell you this, if you walked into the office of all of the leaders of the ancient world, to most of the leaders of the medieval world, and to many of the leaders of the modern world, and you called them a murderer and a traitor and a blasphemer, no insurance company would give you a policy, right? They would say, off with your head. Now let me move on to the Midrash, and let me show you how the rabbis handle the story. The Midrash contains a very strange statement. It says, whoever says that David sinned made a mistake. David says that he sinned. Whoever says that David sinned made a mistake. Whoever doesn't understand the story. Now, how do they explain it? They say all the soldiers in David's army, including the non-Jews who served in his army, all of them gave their wives a get a bill of divorcement before they went off to fight. So if they were missing in action, their wives would not be in limbo, their wives would not be agunot. And since Uriah gave his wife a get before he went off to war, Bathsheba was technically not married, and therefore there was no adultery, and therefore David did not sin. How many of you believe that midrash? If you do, I got a bridge in Brooklyn that I would love to sell you. Why did the rabbis do for David what they do for no other soldier, another character in the Bible? Why do they whitewash David when they whitewash nobody else? In the Bible, when Abraham sins, the Bible says Abraham sinned. When Jacob sins, the Midrash says Jacob sinned. When Moses sinned, the Bible Midrash says Moses sinned. Only for David and nobody else do the rabbis come up with such a far-fetched story to prove that David did not sin. Why did they do for David what they didn't do for anybody else in the whole Bible? Anybody have a guess? Anybody have an idea? The rabbis lived at a very dark time in Jewish history. Temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was in ruins. The country was desolate. Thousands of people carried off into exile. There was only one thing that they could hold on to. Only one thing that gave them a little bit of hope in that dark time. And that was the belief that the Messiah, the descendant of David, would come soon. They prayed 3 times a day. Et tzemach avavdecha mehera tatzmiach, v'karno tarim b'yeshuatecha, ki kivinu kol lo kol hayom. May the descendant of David come soon, and may and what?
Do a budget revision, like at some point during the year. Sometimes when I've done it in the past,
Somebody want a question?
I think also David was punished that the child that was born didn't live.
Wait, we'll get to that. Okay, good point. But why do they whitewash David and nobody else? They pray, they taught us to pray every day. May the descendant of David come soon. May his horn be lifted up. For we hope for him, we wait for him all day, not only every day, but all day. The only thing we have left is the hope that the descendant of David will come soon. And therefore, they just couldn't bear the thought that David had committed a terrible sin. That's why they did for David what they did for nobody else. So in this version, the rabbi's version, who's the hero and who's the villain? Nobody's the hero. Nobody's the villain. Nothing happened. Now let me move to modern Israel. And let me tell you how the story is told there. There's an Israeli writer named Moshe Shamir, no relative of the prime minister, who writes a novel in 1968, which is called Kivsat Harash, the poor man's lamb. And the book goes to the top of the bestseller list in the second half of 67, and it stays #1 on the bestseller list for all of 68, all of 69, all of 70, all of 71, and most of 1972. And the question is why? What is there about this book that captures the attention of the whole people of Israel during those years? Look at the book and you'll see the answer. The book tells the story from the point of Uriah the Hittite. It begins, you remember when Michal let David down the window and helped him escape? David ran into the wilderness, and therefore there he formed a kind of a bootleg army. He attracted a number of outlaws and runaways to his cause. And how did they make their living? They would visit the wealthy sheep owners in the area, and they would offer to protect them from robbers for a price. And if they turned them down, then they really needed protection. And it was during this time, while they were in the wilderness, that David met a woman named Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam. And the two of them fell in love, and they wanted to get married. But the father, Eliam, said, "What? This man is a hunted outlaw? The king has put a price on his head? No daughter of mine is going to marry such a person. No way." And in those days, believe it or not, girls listened to their parents. And so they broke up. And on the rebound, she married Uriah the Hittite. And that's why years later, when David goes for that walk on the rooftop and he sees a beautiful woman and he says, "Who is she?" They say, "Hello, Zot, don't you remember her? That's Bathsheba, the woman you were once in love with." And when David realizes who she is, he invites her to the palace. And when they get together, it's not a rape and it's not a seduction, it's a reunion. It's the meeting of two people who once loved each other and have not seen each other for many years. They make love in the afternoon, that afternoon, and that's how Bathsheba becomes pregnant. And that's why David sends Uriah back to the wars, asking Joab to put Uriah in the front lines so they get killed. So David will be able to marry the woman who's the love of his life. Does Uriah open the letter? According to Shamir's novel, he does. He opens it up and he reads it. And his first reaction is anger. My wife did this to me? My king did this to me? To hell with them. I'm going to go public with this letter and let them be damned. Let her be taken out and executed for violating the law against adultery. Let him be thrown off the throne. This is what they deserve for what they've done to me. And then Uriah thinks it over. And he says, "I can't do it. I can't do it. Because she's my wife and I love her. And he's my king and I care about him. And I don't want to see them destroyed." So he closes the letter up again and he delivers it to Joab. And the army, that's why the text says the army attack had struck Joab, and Joab arrived too late and Uriah dies. But, and this is the climax of the novel, the night before the battle, Uriah writes one last page in his diary. And he gives it to a shepherd boy who's walking by. And he says to him, "Would you do me a favor? I'll give you a couple of bucks. Would you take this diary of mine and bury it in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea?" And on the last page of the diary, Uriah tells the story of what David and Bathsheba did. And the last sentence of the book is, "Who knows? Maybe someday a shepherd boy will go wandering in the caves of Qumran, and he may find this book. And who knows? Someday somebody may translate this book from Hittite into Hebrew. And if they do, then the Hebrews will learn how their ancestor treated the Hittites. Somebody finds this book in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they'll find out. The book comes out in the last half of '67, and it stays on the #1 on the bestseller list for 5 years. And the question is why? What nerve in the Israeli psyche did this book strike that made it such a bestseller? My guess is because in the 1967, the Israelis won a tremendous victory. They defeated 6 Arab armies in 6 days. They tripled the size of the country, and they were in euphoria. I remember they went walking in the old city, and marketplaces, people, the Arabs were too stunned to say a word. They thought they were supermen. And eventually the Israelis began to realize that when they gained all this new land, they also gained a couple million Arabs. And what were they going to do with them? Were they going to give them the vote? If so, they would be outnumbered. Were they going to not give them the vote? They would be an occupying power. And that's the question that Shamir raises in the last sentence of this book. What are the Jews going to do with these Arabs they've inherited? That's the central question that occupies the minds and the hearts of Israelis ever since the Six-Day War. And that's why they were drawn to this book. So according to this version, Uriah is the hero and David is the villain. Let me move to Washington and tell you two quick, unbelievable stories. The first comes from the time of Richard Nixon. I think it's fair to say, whatever your politics, Nixon was not the most religious president we ever had in American history. And yet Nixon did something that no previous president had ever done. Nixon and only Nixon, nobody before and nobody since, had services in the White House. You know why? He was a prisoner in the White House. If he went out, people booed, people jeered. They called him names because of Watergate, because of Vietnam. So he had to stay in the White House. He couldn't go to church if he wanted to. And so what did he do? He had a service in the White House every Sunday. And every Sunday he invited a different minister, Catholic priest, Protestant minister, a Jewish rabbi, to conduct the service and to give the sermon. And one of those weeks, he invited one of my teachers, whose name I'm not going to mention out of respect. If you guess who it was, I'll deny it. This president, this teacher of mine, gave a god-awful sermon. It was obsequious. He praised Nixon beyond all limit. He compared him to Cyrus of Persia. He said, 1,000 years from now, people will look back and see the guiding hand of God in the work of Richard Nixon. Oh, I don't know what he meant, maybe the visit to China. But when he said that, I didn't know what to say. I went to visit my teacher, and we went for a walk on Riverside Drive. And I said to him, how could you give such a sermon? And his answer was, you don't understand. I was born in America. My father was born in Europe. He was born in Tsarist Russia. And never in a trillion years would my father ever dream of being invited to give a sermon to the Tsar. And if he gave a sermon to the Tsar, he certainly would not rebuke him or chastise him and thereby endanger the Jewish people. And I had him in my mind, and that's why I gave that sermon. He may have been right. Remember Eartha Kitt? She gave a concert at the White House, and she stopped in the middle of her program, and she said, Mr. Nixon, stop the bombing. And she never sang again, as the FBI went to every place she was supposed to sing and saw that they boycotted her. So he wasn't Nathan, and who am I to judge? But the second story is even more amazing. Some years ago, Congress created what they call the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's given to that civilian who has done the most for America. And they voted that it should be given on such and such a day, that it should be presented by the president, that it should be given in the White House. And in their wisdom, they chose as the first recipient, Elie Wiesel. And then Bitburg hit the fan. Do you remember Bitburg? Reagan was supposed to go on a tour of Germany, and the Germans arranged the itinerary. And one of the places that they chose was a cemetery called Bitburg, where a number of Nazis and SS soldiers were buried. There was a reason why they wanted Reagan to visit Bitburg. And that was that he would, by going there and by leaving flowers on those graves, he would be saying, enough already with the Holocaust. We've had it up to here with the Holocaust. If Reagan goes to Bitburg, it'll be a way of saying it's over, finished with the Holocaust. We can go about our lives. Reagan's staff probably didn't even know where Bitburg was. And so they agreed with the itinerary that the Germans set up. And when they did, a cry of protest went up from the Jewish community. And in the middle of this, the presentation of the medal by Reagan to Wiesel was coming up. What should they do? At one point, Wiesel threatened not to come. At another point, Reagan threatened not to come. Finally, the day arrived. Reagan presented the medal to Wiesel graciously, and then Wiesel stood up and he said, Mr. President, thank you for the medal, but I ask you today, in the name of civilization, don't go to Bitburg. Your place is not there. You belong with the victims and not with the murderers. And when he said that, the whole audience in the Rose Gardens stood up and applauded, and the whole Western world heard what he said on television. And poor Ronald Reagan sat there, humiliated in front of the whole world. Next time I saw Elie Wiesel, I congratulated him for his courage. And I said to him, wow, you were wonderful that day. You sounded like the prophet Nathan. You confronted one of the mightiest men in the world, and you told him off like Nathan rebuked David. You're the Nathan of our time. And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, you don't understand what happened that day. Reagan had my speech in front of him.
Counted as present vote.
Oh,
What? Am I okay? Reagan had my speech in front of him. He could have excused himself and not come to the ceremony. He could have claimed he was too busy. He could have claimed that an emergency had come up. He could have taken a nap. He chose to be insulted on television. He's the real hero of the story and not me.
budget.
Huh? And when I
Yeah,
heard
Mark was
that,
right.
what? When I heard Wiesel say that, I don't know if I agreed or not. Maybe that was just his modesty. But when he said that, I understood for the first time the story of David and Bathsheba as I never understood it before. Because who wrote that story? I don't know. Who got it into the book of Samuel? I don't know. Who got the book of Samuel into the Bible? I don't know. But this I do know. Whoever wrote the story, whoever got it into the book of Samuel, whoever got it into the Bible, wrote it at a time when somebody from the house of David was on the throne. How do I know? Because if you weren't from the house of David, you were not legally eligible to be on the throne in Judah. So whoever this person was, who told the story, who wrote the story, who got it into Samuel, who got Samuel into the Bible, did it at a time when the descendant of David was on the throne, and that descendant let him do it. Let him do it. Isn't that a respect for freedom of speech? Isn't that a respect for the right of human beings to defy the government? Isn't that a respect for the first of the 10 commandments, they were going to read on Shavuos, which says, "You shall have no other God but me," which means you're not God and you can't behave as if you are. Let me finish by telling you one last story. A story that comes out of Hollywood. I'm not going to say anything about Woody Allen's private life, because I don't think his private life is fitting to talk about in a religious gathering. I want to say one word about his movies. I think it is fair to say that all of his movies mock religion and mock Judaism, with one exception. The one exception is the movie that's called Crimes and Misdemeanors. You remember that movie? It's about an optometrist named Judah, who's about to be honored by the Federation in his community. And then just before the honor, he finds out that somebody knows that he once had an adulterous affair, and that out of that affair, a child was born. So he goes to his nephew, who has mafia connections, and he arranges to have the man killed so that he won't be disgraced right before the Federation affair. And his nephew does so. And then Judah, the optometrist, panics, and he asks himself, what if there's a God in this world? If there's a God in this world, then this is a major, not a petty crime. It's a major, major misdemeanor. And therefore he goes around asking everybody he knows, is there a God in the world? Is there a God in the world? And nobody gives him an answer that satisfies him. And then he figures out, if there's anybody who knows the answer, it's got to be the rabbi. And so on the night of the banquet, instead of socializing with his guests, Judah goes after the rabbi. And he stands right up to him face to face, and he says, prove to me that there's a God in the world. And Judah pesters him and prods him and asks him over and over and over again, prove to me there's a God in the world. And whatever answer the rabbi gives does not satisfy Judah. And then in the last scene of the movie, Judah the optometrist is standing in the corner brooding. And he's watching the rabbi, who is old and nearly blind, dancing with his daughter. They're dancing to the melody of an old, old song, I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places. And Judah sees that there's a certain spiritual light that seems to be shining off the rabbi. And Judah says to himself, I wish I could see what this old man is able to see. The optometrist, the expert on seeing, envies the rabbi, because the rabbi can evidently see something that he can't see. When I saw that movie, I said to myself, wait a minute, Judah? David's from the tribe of Judah. A nephew who can arrange a killing for him? David has a nephew who can arrange a killing for him. Adultery? This man commits adultery and David commits adultery. And I was soon to be able to find a dozen other parallels between this movie and the story of David and Bathsheba. So I wrote a letter to Woody Allen. And in this letter, I said, Dear Mr. Allen, isn't this movie a midrash on the story of David and Bathsheba in the Bible? And I listed all of the parallels. And I waited for an answer. I waited a week. I waited 2 weeks. I waited 3 weeks. And finally, I got a letter from Woody Allen. And I opened it with great, great, great excitement. And this is what it said. Dear Rabbi Riemer. Interesting. Dot, dot, dot. W. What does that mean? I have no idea. I have no idea. But I share the story with you tonight so that you can see how a story that began in the wilderness of Jordan 3,000 years ago made its way from there to Babylon, from there to Jerusalem, from there to Washington, from there to Hollywood, and how it continues to fascinate readers even in our own time. It's an example to me, and I hope for you, of how the Bible continues to live and how it continues to be understood in different generations. And it teaches me on Arab truths that even the man who created Jerusalem is not above the law. No leader, no dictator is above the law. That's the point of the first of the 10 commandments, which we will hear in just a few days. Thank you. Okay, Johanna's clapping. Anybody else want to clap?
Brilliant.
David's clapping, Whitewood's clapping, Paul is clapping. Okay, that's good. Thank you. You're a very polite group. I expected you would chime in when I asked those questions, but nobody did.
We
and
were muted.
You were muted. You were spellbound. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
I hope you liked it. And I hope that it's an example of how the Bible continues to live and how the 10 Commandments continue to live in our time and how a love story can mean different things to different people in different generations. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to hear from you. I went over an hour.
Didn't feel like it.
Didn't feel like it. Thank you.
It's very good.
Thank you.
Yes,
Excellent.
a lot
Come
of
back.
food for thought.
Thank you. Thank you. And come back on Thursday when I'll tell you another biblical story, another love story, which is going to be a little bit shocking. It's going to be an interpretation of a biblical story, the likes of which I bet you never heard before. So no, really.
I
It'll
think
be a-
Diana has a question.
Yes?
I just have a minor question. The fact that David knew Bathsheba when he was a young man and they wanted to get married, and then they were not allowed to get married. Is that biblical or is that midrash?
It's neither. It's Moshe Shamir. It's in his novel, the It's the Poor Man's Lamb.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he gets it he builds this whole novel out of 2 words. Halozot. Don't you remember who she is?
Oh, okay.
That he creates this novel. It's pure Shamir. Shamir. By the way, let me say a word about Shamir. He wrote a novel, an autobiography, and it's called Chayayim Yishmael, My Life with Ishmael, which means the Arabs. He says, I'm named after my uncle who was killed by the riots in 48. And he was named after his uncle who was killed in the riots of 29. And he was named for his uncle who was killed in the riots of 86. And yet, I want to make peace with Ishmael. How do you do that? Like for 3 generations, you carry that that burden in your name. How do you not? Today's news was very painful from Israel. It was that the Arabs mobbed the place that they worship above the Kotel and rioted there because they heard a rumor that the Israelis were going to destroy the mosque. Where'd they get that rumor? I don't know. But they rioted, and the Israeli police had to come and calm them with water cannons and with guns and with rifles. And when the fighting was over, 20 Arabs were killed, 200 were wounded, and Yom Yerushalayim, The day when Jews are supposed to unite with each other and unite with the Arabs and make one city was more divided than ever before. I mean, how do you unite this forever divided city? I mean, Netanyahu, every time he speaks, says, we are uniting Jerusalem. The reality is they're not. And how can they, and who can? And that's the dilemma, maybe the unanswerable question that faces Israel. Not to give the Arabs rights is to create an apartheid state. To give them rights is to become a minority in your own country. Take your pick. Whatever you choose is not gonna work. And so they struggle with this question. Yeah, thank you for the question. Anybody else? Anybody else have a question? Seriously, come back Thursday because I'm gonna take one of the women in the Bible whom I always thought we understood and share with you a recent poem that gave me a whole new perspective on who she is. So I'll tell you what it deals with. Here's the question, are women smarter than men? And if they are, should they show it? Second question is harder than the first. If they are, if you're smarter than your husband, should you let him know or not? I'm going to show you that motif as it works its way through the Bible. So if anybody here is smarter than their husbands and doesn't know whether to tell them so or not, come back on Thursday. Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi. We're all looking forward to Thursday night. Everyone, please tell your friends, family members, the glory of Zoom is you can be anywhere in the world and you can attend Thursday's lecture. And we're revving up toward Shavuot. So it's really, really important to have this great Torah learning going on in our community as we prepare for Shavuot. I want to take just a few moments here just to thank our committee, Claire and Vivian, who helped to bring Rabbi Riemer to our community, of course, with Johanna and Karen Evans, and to our tech support tonight, to Erica and to Blake. And if I have forgotten anyone, we are just all so grateful that we're able to study together with Rabbi, and we look forward to even more Torah on Thursday.
Thank you very much.
With that, Lila Tov, everyone.
Lila Tov, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.